Hello, my name is Danny Nolan and I'm the Director of Chassis Sim Technologies. And welcome to this latest episode of Dan's Vehicle Dynamics Corner. And today, ladies and gentlemen, I've got a real treat for you. What we're going to be talking about today is integrating the lap time simulation and driver-in-the-loop components of Chassis Sim. And the reason I'm so excited to be bringing this to you today, ladies and gentlemen, this has come off the back of a job that we have been sworn to secrecy over. However, this job used both the lap time simulation, the shaker rig, and almost by accident we used driver in the loop. But in the employment of driver in the loop and carrying it back to what we'd learnt in the lap time simulation, there were a few light bulb moments, and I'm really keen to share this with you today. So, introduction. When it comes to lap time simulation and driver in the loop, there's always been an historical divide. And indeed, I've heard a lot of my colleagues in the motorsport vehicle dynamics community almost get to the point when driver in the loop first came onto the scene to completely and utterly ignore what the work that they'd done with lap time simulation. Now, there were a number of drivers in this, but the big driver is that invariably one of the big traps with lap time simulation is that you work really hard on a setup. It goes quicker and quicker and quicker. When you put it on the car, it's effectively undrivable. And I've spoken in past tutorials as to why that is. And I think today what we're going to be talking about, it will put that into a bit of sharper relief, but hopefully it will show you, more importantly, how you can bridge that gap between what you'll see in lap time simulation and it getting quicker and quicker to what you'll see in handling on the car. And in particular, the big thing about this, and forgive me if I sound like a broken record on this, is the stability index channel is that link. Now, here's the thing about why we can do this, particularly in the chassis sim environment. We can do this in the chassis sim environment because the numerical engine is the same for both tools. If you go through and look at the code commonality between the chassis sim lap time simulation and chassis sim driver in the loop, you take a look at the numerical engine, the code commonality is 95%. All we've really done with chassis sim driver in the loop is take out the autonomous driving features and added some sanity checks for crazy driver inputs. That's it. That's the major differences. And so I'm going to show you this with some data from the lap time simulation, and then we're going to cross-reference this to some driver in the loop videos. So let's get started. So, quick primer, stability index. Now, for those of you who have seen my previous stability index videos, you can tune out for about 30 seconds or so. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the stability index, let me give you a quick refresher here. Okay, the neutral steer line is a great measure of stability if the car is being driven hard. Vis-a-vis, you've got someone like Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen et al. Driving the car. However, to get an absolute measure of this, we need something else. And what the stability index does is it takes the concept of the static margin in longitudinal aircraft dynamics and reapplies this to the automotive environment. So what we're measuring is the non-dimensionalized moment arm between the center of the lateral forces of the car and the center of gravity. And what we're doing when we talk about percentage static margin, we're talking about the percentage of this moment arm versus the wheelbase. So that's pretty much stability index in a nutshell. Okay, so what do the values mean? So if the stability index is less than 0, the car is stable. If you give it an input, it will return to, the car will stabilize itself. It's not going to swap hands. If it's 0, you give it a little bit of an input and it'll just keep on going. If it's greater than 0, the car is unstable. Any input has to be corrected. Now, rough rule of thumb here. The thing that separates the superstars from your mere mortals when it comes to driving a race car is the really, really good drivers can tolerate a really low value of stability index. And that's really the thing that sorts the Senners, the Michael Schumachers, the Lewis Hamiltons, the Max Verstappens from your journeyman race car drivers. That's a case in point. There's a very old video on YouTube of Jean Alesi hitting a wet spot at the Canadian Grand Prix and Ayrton Senna hitting the same wet spot at the Canadian Grand Prix. And really goes to show what separates out a really good driver from someone who is a total megastar. Now, rough rule of thumb: a good start point is -5 to -10%, and you can tolerate the occasional excursion under brakes to about +10%, albeit that's more the current limitations of how we're calculating the stability index in chassis sim. However, we're going to return to this point. Okay, example 1, the LMP2 Plus car. Now, for those of you who did the chassis sim competition, the 2020 chassis sim competition around Le Mans, it was based around this particular car. Now, a little bit of an apology in advance here. Because of the nature of the time model, the stability index calculation for this car was a bit all over the place, albeit for that particular competition. I wanted to give you guys an example of when you were dealing a very difficult to tune car, and also too, I did have to abstract it from my current customers' LMP2 cars, but we're nitpicking here. So the current that baseline LMP2 Plus car was really borderline in terms of its stability. And I'll talk to, and this will be evidence in the graphs in just a moment. So what I did was that I took the aero balance for this particular car backwards about 5%. And the reason I took it backwards about 5% is I wanted to see what it did with the stability index. And here's an example below. So I ran it up at Eastern Creek. So the colored is our borderline stability baseline car, where the car was really, really squirrely. The black was when we moved the aero balance back by about 5%. So here you've got speed, you've got RPM, you've got steered angle, you have throttle, lateral G, gear, curvature. The money shot's down below, which is stability index. So that slightly lightish brown yellowish trace is our baseline, and as you can see, it's pretty borderline in terms of stability, particularly for the high-speed sweeper at turn 1 at Eastern Creek. The black is our change at -5%. And as you can see, the car's a bit more settled. It's still a little squirrely, but particularly in the mid-corner, we're looking at a static margin going from -4% to -9.65%. We're going to see the full significance of this a little bit more when we actually do the driver in the loop video. But let me flag that for the time being. The other thing that I also want to flag here as well is in terms of the current limitations about how we're calculating the stability index numbers in chassis sim. So we use a pretty simple calculation to make sure that the lap time simulation can keep up in terms of its speed. So we haven't taken into account the full effect of yaw damping here. So even if you see a number at 0%, you've probably got an effective buffer there of about -1, -2%, and that's basically because of your yaw damping effect. So let's now have a chat about the F3 car. So what we did with the F3 car was that we took our baseline, and what I did was I just moved the aero balance forward to get to the point where the stability index was now going to be really, really touch and go. So, same scales as before, like with our LMP2 Plus car. Now, what's really interesting here, as you can see, not surprisingly, with moving the aero balance forward 10%, you can see at the bottom trace down here, the stability index at +10%, the stability index is now absolutely borderline. So you're at that point where you've only got to give it a small perturbation and the thing's going to swap hands. But one thing I want to point out here, the static margin for the F3 car is -3.6%. Now, the astute viewers of this are going to cross-reference this back to the LMP2 Plus car and say, well, hang on, you've got, for your so-called stable -5% aero balance car, you're now looking at a stability index values of -5 to -10%. So why do you get away with it here, but you don't get away with it here? We're going to talk about that momentarily. We will talk about that momentarily. But now that we've seen both of these stability index values that have been calculated in the lap time simulation, Let's now have a look at some video because the video is really, really instructional. So, a couple of things a couple of disclaimers here. The stability index, what you're about to see with these videos, they're not going to be the world's greatest quality, and that's down to the limitation of my video capture software. So apologies in advance. But what I will do, and also too, another apology in advance for my rather pathetic attempts at being a race car driver. But the important thing is the takeaways from it. So to kick this off, let's have a look at our LMP2 baseline. That's going to be very marginal in terms of stability. So here we've got our marginal stability car. We're coming in. So as you can see, a little bit squirrely in turn one. We're going to hit the brakes, and a little bit squirrely on turn in. And as you can see, really, we're now paying the price for that borderline stability. Let's now have a look at that with the aero balance at plus 5%. So going into turn one, what we can now see is the car's a lot more planted. That little squirrely thing is basically gone away. So if we take a look at our braking into turn one, a lot more planted on the turn in. Now you'll see me oversteer a little bit. That's me just getting a little bit too happy on the throttle. But here, I can absolutely plant it. I can recover it, and I can drive away. Ditto as we go into turn one. That's about 144, 156. So that is our example of our before and after change. If we go back here to our stability index plot, you can see really clearly that with the lap time simulation and the stability index channel, we predicted what we were going to do with the driver in the loop, particularly with regards to drivability. Let's now have a look at the F3 example. So here's our baseline F3 car. So as you see, a little pointing in turn one, but relatively well balanced. Going into turn two, we're going to brake. A little bit of waviness, but that's actually more me than anything else. So, nice and settled, not doing anything particularly evil. Let's now have a look at when we move the aero balance forward plus 10%. So as you can see, going into turn one, see now we're really borderline there. Let's see what happens when we go into turn two. So we're on the brakes. So as you can see, okay, so I'm taking it here a little bit. I'm taking it a little bit easy here. Now I'm going to really plant it. I'm going to go into turn three, and as you can see, whoa, getting the tank, really getting the tank slapper here going. But again, that really underscores what we saw here again in our stability index channel from the lap time simulation, and the fact that we were able to use that to predict what we were going to do in terms of drivability. So that's a really, really, really key takeaway point. Okay, so some rules of thumb, and that really sort of one of the things I do want to bring up here is again touch upon again some of the limitations in the stability index channel in the chassis sim lap time simulation. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer here: these limitations are not because the fundamental concept is flawed. Quite to the contrary, as we've just seen, the fundamental concept is very, very sound. However, the reason it's different is because of the fact that the two things that it doesn't have incorporated in the lap time simulation is firstly the yaw damping effects, and the other thing it doesn't incorporate into it is the traction circle effects, like when you're on full power, when you're under braking, which will affect the stability index plots when you're in mixed traction conditions. Now that's primarily because that's purely just a function of time and the fact that we're engaged in a number of different projects in chassis sim. So consequently, as a consequence of this, what you're going to see is you're going to see different stability index numbers that are going to work for different power levels, and that's all dictated by the traction circle. So in this particular case, for the F3 car, we were dealing with engine we were dealing with engine power at the wheels around about the 170 kilowatt range. For the LMP2 Plus car, you were dealing with about 400 kilowatts or so at the wheels. So here are some really, really good rough rules of thumb to go to in terms of how you do your handling. So if you're dealing with a superstar, so rough rule of thumb, if you're dealing with engine powers in the order about 170 kilowatts or so, your superstar can tolerate about -3 to -4% of engine power. Once you're getting engine power about 400 kilowatts or so, you're looking at about -5 to -7% in terms of what they can tolerate in terms of static margin. If you're dealing with a full-on fire-breathing monster, once you're starting to talk 600 kilowatts or so at the wheels, you're talking at -8, -10%. So that's some rough rule of thumb for superstar territory. Average driver, this is what I would call your very, very good amateur driver who can give you reasonable feedback, but they'll probably be, as a rough rule of thumb, around about a second and a half slower, give or take, depending on the circuit, than your superstar. So rough rule of thumb, engine power, -6 to -8% for 170 kilowatts or so rear-wheel drive at the wheels. 400 kilowatts for your P2 car, you're looking at -10 to -12%. Engine power, 600 kilowatts or so, -12 to -14%, give or take. Okay, bad driver. Vis-a-vis, this is the sort of driver you pray you never get. Vis-a-vis, these are the sort of drivers who say to you, "Oh, I was so busy concentrating on the low-speed corners, I forgot about the high-speed corners." I actually had a driver say that to me. At that point, I was too young to think about it, but I really should have said, "Son, OPB, other professions beckon." Or I got to admit, my favorite driver quote of all time was this driver went for a test then at an unnamed circuit, because I don't want to incriminate the guilty here, and came back, and the race engineer said, "So how was it?" And this guy said, "Imagine a pink blouse and a washing machine going around and around and around." That's your really typical thing of, the bad drivers. They're the guys that you really need to be watching out for. So, rough rule of thumb, engine power for your 170 kilowatt cars about -12%. Engine power at about 400 kilowatts, -16%. Engine power at about 600 kilowatts or so is -20%. Now, of course, these are rules of thumb. They're going to vary from they will vary from car to car, but at least you've got something to hang your hat on, so that when you start looking at your lap time simulation data, you can look at this with confidence to say, yes, this is where I need to dial in my handling. And of course, in the other videos where we talk about using the stability index, speed multiplier in chassis sim, this is where these sort of numbers really start to make their presence felt. So, wrapping things up. Okay, tips and tricks and some food for thought. What this is showing is what you see with the lap time simulation with the stability index is going to be reflected in chassis sim driver in the loop. So that really gives you a lot of confidence. And indeed, with that job that I was talking about at the start of this presentation, for me, that was a massive light bulb moment. It was just like, oh, wow, this stuff really, it was like, wow, this stuff really, really works. And when I conferred with the customer, it very much confirmed with their expectations about where they needed to go. That being said, though, the numbers you're going to use in terms of the absolute numbers you're going to hang your hat on is going to be highly dependent on the engine power that you'll be dealing with, and that's primarily because of the fact that the higher the engine power goes, the less tractive force, the less lateral force, sorry, the lateral force that you've got available at the rear. But the real takeaway is that you can use the lap time simulation to really nail down your handling, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is a huge, huge plus in terms of really giving you confidence to know not only do you have a quick car, but you have a car that is drivable. So at that point, I'm going to wrap up the tutorial today, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Dan's Vehicle Dynamics Corner.